And welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee. I'm really pleased that Philip was able to get back in time from his little journey to London, where he brought us back some good news. Right, if we could move to item 1 on the agenda is the evacuation procedure. We are not expecting a fire drill, so as you all know, once outside the building, gather outside the Yorkshire Bank. Anyone needs any help, just say so, and make sure all your mobile phones are turned off and silenced. I bet it's not. Right, apologies. Do we have any apologies?
Apologies from Grant Patson.
From Grant. I have an apology from Sarah. She will be joining us if she can make it here. She's having to look for a carer for her husband. But if she can make it, she will do so. Right. We could move on to the minutes to confirm the minutes of the meeting here on Tuesday the 22nd of January. Do we agree that they are a correct record of the meeting? Everyone okay with that? Wait, I will just back. Right. Declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations of interest other than those that are already published within the agenda? No? Okay. 5 is public consultation. I do have a list of speakers, and I will call the speakers as we reach each individual item on the agenda. So the first item on the agenda is actually agenda, I think it's on the special one, agenda item 6, a separate one that we were sent.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Gabby, that's yourself. Sorry, I forgot to introduce Gabby at the bar, who is here. Would be with Grant, who can't be with us.
Grant Patson sends his apologies, unfortunately he's double booked, so he's in attendance somewhere else. We've got 2 items on the agenda. The first one is in relation to certification work that we've done for the housing benefits work for the claim for 2017-18. The work went really well, so thank you very much to all the officers who were involved in the claim and to the finance team. We made some minor amendments in value, which were very low in value in terms of the actual overall claim of 35.6 million, so which is very pleasing. I don't propose to sort of go through the specific areas, so unless you have any questions, I think overall it's a good audit, it went well and consistent with previous years.
Okay, so we have agenda item 6, as you hear, it is the certification letter. Did you want to speak, Craig?
No. As Javid said, it's pleasing that it's only £4,700 against a £35 million claim. So it's extremely low value. Yes, it's qualified, but it has to be. But it's one of those things. Yeah, it's just bringing it to members' attention because we have to do it and they have to note.
Okay. So, are we therefore? Anyone have any comments they wish to make on agenda item 6? So, do we note the report? That agreed?
Yeah.
Moving to agenda item 7. which is the audit progress report and sector update. I mean, I think it's you there.
Okay. Right, this is our sort of our regular progress report to yourselves, so we're informing you exactly where we are in terms of our audit, in terms of sort of comparing against our audit plan. So at this point of the year, the main deliverables were sort of getting our sort of the planning out of the way and getting the sort of the interim work out of the way, which basically means we'll come in and do some of our early testing around it. We've done our testing this year in 2 visits, and pleasing to know we made good progress. So we're very, very pleased with that. We've not got any specific issues to bring to the attention of the committee. We said we've already had our plan out at the last meeting, so there's no specific issues at this moment in time that we need to raise ourselves. In terms of our value for money work, that we'll be picking that up next week once we have our meetings with the executive directors, specifically with Simone Hines. So that will be underway from next week. In terms of our sort of national sort of sector updates, there's a number of reports that have been issued that we sort of bring to your attention. We're not expecting any specific actions from you from yourselves. This is about sort of keeping you informed about sort of national issues and potentially that could have an impact on you as an authority. There's a number of reports in there which I don't propose to go through, but I think the theme that seems to be coming through is around financial sustainability, around sort of council's medium-term financial plans, and the significant issues are really facing both local government and the NHS. Again, not expecting any specific actions from yourselves, but it is again about raising awareness and about sort of things that might be of interest to yourself. Just take any questions.
Okay. Anyone have any questions on agenda item 7? No? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. If we could move to agenda item 8. We do have a speaker on agenda item 8, but first of all, Linda, you're going to present this.
Chair. Yes, this report sets out the internal audit plan for 2019-20, and also I've provided an update on the counter-fraud activity as the counter-fraud officer now reports to myself. With regards to the internal audit plan, we do carry out a risk assessment, and the public sector internal audit standards require us to have an internal audit plan based on risk. And I've set out in paragraph 4.1 the factors that we consider in carrying out that assessment. And from that assessment, we then give each area a score. That score then dictates how often we should be looking at it. And we look at the last time we reviewed it and we develop the plan. That's the way that we develop the plan. I've also, it's been presented to management team. All directors have had an input to this. And Simone has specifically asked as Section 151 officer that we carry out some value for money reviews, or we allocate some time to do some value for money reviews. We haven't actually got any subject areas for that at the moment, but it would cover areas where there's maybe large underspends that Simone, Section 151 officer, is concerned about, and she'd like internal audit to spend some time looking at them. So on the plan, which is set out in Appendix A on page 13, that's why we've just got value for money reviews with no actual subject matter against it. With regards to counter-fraud activity, the current officer's been employed with us and has been with us since June of last year. It's a shared role, spends 2 days at North Warwickshire and 3 days at Nuneaton and Bedworth. So far this year, just at Nuneaton and Bedworth Borough Council is identified cashable savings to the public purse, that's not necessarily Nuneaton and Bedworth's budgets, of around £113,000. And we're also looking at the notional savings that are being achieved, and we're using the notional savings that the Cabinet Office used for their National Fraud Initiative that they publish in their Protecting the Public Purse document. So for example, if we identify a fraudulent benefit claim and that claim is withdrawn, they make the assumption that had it not been for that intervention, that claim would have continued for at least another 21 weeks. So as at the point that I drafted this report, the notional savings were £1.4 million almost. So it's been very successful so far this year. So I think that's all I'd like to say. If there are any questions.
Okay, well, before we go into questions, Councillor Conlon, call you for that to speak on this item.
Thank you very much, Chair. Firstly, I'll mention asbestos management and Legionella. They're things when I was on internal audit, and as it was, they're really important, and we tend not to keep up with them. So I hope we're doing those fairly early, and we'll actually flag up if there's actually not keeping up with those programmes. Because the trouble is, internal audit and you only report every quarter or something. Yeah, it might be a long while before we get the results of those reviews, and particularly asbestos and Legionella, they are really key things that we need to keep on top of. On your operational audits, I always think you do marvellous audits, so it's interesting to read what you found out. I have lots of concerns about obviously planning and things, and we've had a lot of issues. And in terms of your audits, do you start with like customer complaints to find out areas that aren't working well, or because I think that would help in terms of targeting procedures where the public have lots of concerns. Obviously people are unhappy with planning decisions, but sometimes people are unhappy with how the paperwork was done, and I mean, in particular case, the last planning meeting, there's an air quality report I was sent 8 minutes before a planning meeting. So there's lots of issues over documents where people need to get the documents right. So I hope your development control internal audit is really looking at the places where the system is failing, not just where people disagree with decisions, but actually where people are saying this wasn't a fair hearing because no one notified me of this, or the documents were wrong. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Evans, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I just wanted to put on record, I think we'll all welcome the work that the Counterford officer has done in saving the council a lot of money. I just wanted to ask Linda, has there ever been an audit into the Civic Hall? Or?
Yes, we have audited Civic Hall before. I'm not quite sure how long ago it's been, but
Right.
it is on our list of areas that we would look at.
Is that something that you would consider looking at in the future?
Yeah, depending on how high a risk we see the area, we could audit it once every 2 years, once every 3 years, or just once every 5 years. If we deem it to be too low a risk, then at this point in time we'd say no, we don't look at that, but we still keep it on the list, still keep it on the radar. I believe the Civic Hall we probably look at that probably once every 3 years, and it's not one that's come up on this list.
Yeah, that's why.
We must have done it within the last 3 years, I would say.
Yeah. Right.
Chair, thank you. I think it would help us all, Linda, to just confirm what internal audit is about in this organisation, because obviously different organisations have a slightly different focus for internal audit. Some, they are there to provide a second line of defence. Some, it's about doing strategic development and identifying where processes could be improved. People put their own spin on it and their own direction and their own focus. From our perspective, this does look like very much like this is what management is saying. These are risks that the council's exposed to, and they're scored. Go away and look at that, rather than any attempt at process improvement. It also does feel very much like it doesn't address anything like what would be priorities for the residents, because I think if you look at the feedback that we get on the door and emails that we get and complaints and the social media feedback, it's very clearly that the public are looking for more transparency around the amounts of money involved with planning and new housing development, and then how that money that is raised in Section 106 and other ways gets spent, and where it gets spent, and does it meet the council's commitment to be spent in the area it's supposed to be raised, and all these other things. And then the third thing is that the public expect is, well, what about service delivery and complaints? Is that not, as the speaker said, driving audits into, well, if this area isn't working right, if people are constantly phoning up and saying Glendale aren't emptying the bins in this park or on this footpath and it's all overflowing, how does audit pick up on that and actually give an objective view which says, well, you may be getting some residents complain about that, but it's actually only happened twice and that's not very serious, and you know, or it's, yes, this is continually happening, this is a systemic failure from the supplier or by our own internal team, and this is the suggested remedies for that. So I can see that there's what internal management want. I can see there's what that there's legislation that says we want to be looking at minimising risks, you know, about Legionella and all that kind of other stuff. And then I can see that there's what the residents would want and expect out of our internal audit. Can you give us a really good feel for what the priority is from your perspective, what guidance you're given by senior management in what the focus of internal audit should be at this organisation?
Yeah, I think we've got twofold. The risk assessment we've done here is to develop a plan to decide which areas that we're going to focus on during the next 12 months. When we actually come to doing the audits themselves, we do look at complaints, we try and focus on risk, so we do talk to managers, we do some research, we look at any complaints that there are on the system, and we try and focus on risk and look at how we can actually improve the service that the council is providing in those areas. So that is the aim of each of the audits. So there's a risk assessment process that develops the plan, and then we do another risk assessment when we actually come to do each of these audits.
Right, so it's a combination. So management are setting the, you know, in terms of what are the risks to their business or they perceive as the agenda. You deal with the most important ones on an annual basis, others on a biannual,
And we
yearly.
also take into account what's in the risk registers as well, and what the key risks are, strategic risks are to the council.
And as and when you hit on one of these areas, it becomes time to do it, then you would look at complaints.
Yes.
But by no stretch of the imagination is complaints driving what goes to the top of this. That was all I just wanted to
No,
establish.
we just
Thank you.
take that into account
Yeah.
and deciding then which are the riskier areas and what we think we should focus on. And although management do have an input, we're still driving our audits. Management have an input to the process, but they don't actually drive it.
Just one final thing, given the largest things that the council does in terms of, you know, the wider economy and the amounts of money that and profit and expenditure that it causes to happen, have you ever done an audit into planning at the borough? Has there ever been
We
a
have looked
detail?
at the planning and looking, but it's probably looking at the process. The
Rather
process
than an
that
end-to-end
followed.
and,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone have any further comments to make on that particular report? Okay, thank you, Linda. Moving on to, sorry. Yeah, on the recommendation and 2.1. The recommendation is that the internal audit plan at Appendix A be approved and the work of the counter fraud officer be noted. Is that agreed?
I'll second.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so moving on to agenda item 9 is the external quality assessment of the internal audits.
Thanks, Chair.
Quite a mouthful there, Linda.
Yeah. Again, the public sector internal audit standards require that every local authority has an external assessment of the internal audit service against those standards at least once every 5 years. And the last external assessment we had here was in 2013. So Gateway Ashore Limited were appointed to undertake an assessment. I've attached their full report at Appendix A to the report, which starts on page 18. But in paragraph 5.2, at the body of my report, I've tried to summarise the main observations that were made, and I've put in there my response and what we plan to do. I agree with most of what the the company has said, but you'll see on page 16, the first one at the top there, I only partially agree with that. I do agree that bullet point 2 in the manual does need to be updated, but bullet 2 isn't about the stages that I carry out a management review of the work that it's done. It relates to how I monitor how an audit is progressing rather than the quality of work that's being done. So I think there needs to be some clarity in point 2, but we have got a formal review process. I do have a management review sheet. I do review everything before a draft report goes out. So I think the procedures we've got in place are quite clear there. The second point there, where they mentioned that we have got a small team. There's only me and 2 full-time equivalent officers within the internal audit team, and they say that supervision may be verbal. But as I've said, we have got a formal management review process. That's fully documented. That's put on the files. If they need any information via email, and I think it's important that they keep the email, and that's kept electronically as well. So I don't think there's any more need to make any more notes of supervision. So I disagree with what they said there. They also said we put on all the recommendations that we make in reports, we prioritise them. At the moment, we've got 5. They were recommending we reduce them to 3. Now, recommendation priority 5 is just where it's best practice. So it's not necessarily going to improve the control environment or the processes that they follow, but it's an area that they may want to consider. And I think that's quite important, so I think that that should be included. So we will carry on doing that. And then the final one is about the structure of assignment should focus on identified risks. We do focus on risk. With such a small team, we don't have the resources to look at everything, so we do very much focus on risk. Not necessarily a direct link in our paperwork to the council's risk registers, so that's an area we do look at them, so maybe we could establish a closer link and put that in their working papers. But the rest of it I've agreed with. Any questions?
Anyone have any questions they want to raise?
Chair, thank you. Looking at this, can I just ask first of all, who picked Gateway Assurance, just out of interest?
There are very few. There are very few. There are a few companies that will provide these external assessments. Some of them, like SIPFA, are very expensive. So I do have a group set up, a Midlands audit group, and I asked other authorities, who have you used, and I obtained recommendations. And there are 2 main providers, a lady called Elizabeth Humphrey and then Robin, who works for Gateway Assure, and the better references were coming from Robin. The prices were very similar, so on that basis I've made the decision to go there.
Thanks. I ask because it sounds like you've saved us some money and done some decent due diligence on them, and I think it's important that, for the record, we are transparent and explain why that's happened. I can see their recommendations, and some of it, particularly in respect to tying stuff back on the first competency one and the first delivery one, which you've accepted and then partially accepted. Tying it back to the risk register, that would be, from a commercial entity, very standard practice. Again, this is about how I think outsiders would look at the council and say, muddled, and I don't mean that in a negative way, it's not clear, I think, to outsiders from a commercial world or to residents of the borough who would be looking at service delivery as being their point of reference, that this fits either of those. This is much more of an internal, for the benefit of the internal management here, it seems, at the borough. And it seems that they're picking up on, well, actually, it should be more aligned to some more objective things rather than subjective things, so your risk register and things like that. Is there any plan to overhaul the brief that you're given in terms of internal audits to look wider? Is there any work that's going to be done that you're aware of to
we set out for each of the audits when we come to do them, we set our own brief, we set our own scope. And if there are things that we don't think that we should be involved in because we see them as low risk, we would put that, because we issue an internal audit brief for every review that we carry out, and we issue that to the managers so they're fully aware of what we're going to be looking at. But in all fairness to Gateway Ashore, they've carried out a review against the standards, and it's the standards that perhaps focus on risk registers and focusing on risk. So that's why a lot of his comments are linked around that.
And your team, you touched on a couple of times, is quite small. Exactly who is in the internal audit team, just so that we all know?
I've just got 2 full-time equivalents, Sophie Pavia-Smith and Nafisa Sheikh, 2 full-time people. I obviously manage the team, but I've got a lot of other responsibilities as well, so internal audit is a very, very small part, so I always agree the audit brief with them, so I'm happy with what they're looking at, and then I monitor the progress of the audits as they're doing them, and I look at the quality of the work that they produce before a draft report's been issued, so that tends to be my input.
Thank you. Finally, I think you've maybe hit the nail on the head there with resources, and I know at previous audit meetings that we've had over the last few years, you haven't always completed the audit programme over the year because things have cropped up and you've had to do emergency stuff, or people have been off and things like that. And I guess with a small team, if you're not getting through all of the the wish list of work, you're probably not backfilling all of the keeping documentation up to date, which is what a lot of this seems to be saying, these recommendations. But do you think all of those action by dates are realistic? Will it all be up to date by then?
I think so.
Take that?
I've set the dates. That wasn't set by Gateway Ashore. I've set the dates, and they are fairly straightforward. Some of them are, in updating the charter. Before he came in, I knew that needed updating because the last time it was reviewed was in 2013. But I thought if we could have an input from an outsider as to what needed to be updated and how it should be changed, we would benefit from that. So they are fairly straightforward changes.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wishes to speak? Okay, there is a recommendation on page 14. Is that recommendation agreed? Okay, thank you. Moving on therefore to item 10, it is the local government ethical standards report. Philip, is this?
Yes, it is, Chair, thank you. Yes, Chair, if you members of the committee may recall that we submitted a consultation response to the Committee on Standards in Public Life, who were conducting a review of ethical standards in local government, following the changes that were made in the Localism Act 2011. And a copy of our response is at Appendix B. This was as agreed by the committee at the time, and that went off. The response, the report from the committee has been published in January. It's the 20th report. I think the last local government report was the 3rd, so it was quite high on their list of priorities, certainly back in the day. And as you'll, I don't know whether members have, but there is a link there to the full report if anybody cares to have a look at it. What I've produced in Appendix A is the executive summary, which gives a sort of an overview of the report, and attached to the executive summary are a list of recommendations that the committee are making to government, principally, for changes that they think should be made in the ethical standards regime for local authorities. There are a number of headline issues in here, some of which I won't go through them all, but I'll just pick out a couple for you. The first is in the context of sanctions. I think it was a fairly, I won't say unanimous, but it was a fairly close to unanimous response to the committee that the sanctions that are currently available to standards committees are inadequate, and certainly the committee of the day when the local act came out was concerned about the sanctions or lack of them, and so the recommendation is, and it is in the list of recommendations, that recommendation 16, that local authorities should be given the power to suspend councillors without allowances for up to 6 months. We didn't ask for that, we asked for less than that, but there seems to be a general view that if councillors are particularly misbehaving, that this committee should have that power in extreme circumstances, I would suggest, but that it could have the power to suspend a member for that period of time, or up to that period of time. The other thing to flag is recommendation 18, which is the suggestion that the criminalisation of pecuniary interests has proved to be a damp squib. There has been since 2011 one prosecution, and that's not to say that there's only been one infringement, but it is a piece of legislation that is rarely used, if ever, and the view from the committee is that it achieves very little in terms of member behaviour, and therefore the recommendations you'll see is that should be abolished. And as I say, there's a detailed explanation in the full report if you want to have a look at that. The other thing, I just mentioned this because it will be an issue that we, if it is brought about, then we'll have to have a look at what this means. And I understand the sense of this, that in recommendation 8, there is a suggestion that the independent person should be appointed for no more than 2 years at a time and no more than 4 in total. And I suspect the rationale for that is that if they're independent persons for too long, then they cease to be independent, particularly in some cases they may be dealing with similar issues. So that will present us with a slight logistical issue that we'll have to work out in terms of replacing independent persons, if that's accepted by government. But it does certainly make sense. We do have, currently, we have a panel of 10 independent persons across 4 councils across Warwickshire, and includes Solihull. And what we were discussing with other monitoring officers, whether we divvy that up into 4, and we use a particular quarter for a period, then we move to the next quarter, and then move to the next quarter, and the next quarter. So that gives us a bit longer before we have to go out to recruit. It is like pulling teeth trying to find volunteers to become independent persons. The other thing to highlight is that in the report, the recommendation is that the reports of independent persons should be made available and published. We do that to a degree in our summary report that we bring to members here, but there is a suggestion that that should be made more transparent to the general public. But in order to do that, they've also recognised, the committee, that there will be a need to consider indemnities for independent persons. And I have to say, one of the issues I think that we may have is finding independent persons who are prepared to put their name on the dotted line when they're told that this is how it's going to be. But it's something that we will have to cross. It's a bridge we'll cross when we get to it. I'm not going to, obviously some of the recommendations there are in connection with parishes. We don't have any parish areas, so they don't affect us. There is as well, and on page 45, Chair, and 46, is a list of best practice, i.e. this is what we would expect to see in a good standards committee, in a good council. So what I've committed to do with you, or whoever's in your seats in the next municipal year, if it's not you, that we would undertake a benchmarking exercise against those best practice standards. Largely, having looked through them, I think we do comply with the vast majority, either completely or to some extent. There are some subtle additions that are made here that we don't do that we could do. And obviously some relate to what happens in parish areas as well, so we wouldn't be able to comply with those. But it is something that I have suggested in the recommendation when we come to it, that we bring a report back to the next committee against those standards, so that we can see, and from that we can then develop an action plan for improving our processes to bring them up to these best practice standards. So, Chair, if I can just take you to the recommendation on page 35. It is just to note the executive summary. At this stage, there's no further action we can take until government now respond to this. As you'll note, some of it will or possibly require legislation, so it'll be up to government. I'm sure they'll get to it eventually, although I think they're busy with other matters at the moment, as we all know. But the recommendation 2.2 is to undertake that benchmarking exercise, so we can at least crack on with that in the interim.
I'll come to the recommendation later on the report. I have two speakers. Mrs. Conde, please.
Thank you. There were quite a few things in this that sort of I wanted to comment on. One was an Appendix B on page 47. This term used sub-criminal behaviour, because it's not a term that I could even find a definition for. Behaviour is either criminal or it's not criminal, and this sub-criminal behaviour is trying to, in my opinion, put sort of the idea that people are sort of heading towards being criminals for something which is absolutely nothing to do with, crime. It's just sort of how people sort of view what the action is. On page 38, the bottom paragraph on the left column, any standards process needs to have safeguards in place to ensure that decisions are made fairly and impartially, and that councillors are protected against politically motivated, malicious or unfounded allegations of misconduct. And I think that is something that isn't really happening here at this council. I have been involved in standards things in various guises, from having put in complaints. When I put in a complaint and things, I'm just told it's political banter. Things. When other people have been accused of bullying, to me, looking at it, I think it's just standing up for residents, which is what all councillors have been elected to do. And further on, where it said that you should actually have this should include a definition of bullying and harassment, because I think that is absolutely key, because things that I've heard people here at this council say is bullying, I do not consider bullying, it to be bullying, and that's very difficult. Standard hearings are not impartial, because the jury, in effect, the standards panel, in standards and things, have already made an opinion of the person. In a court of law, you cannot be on a jury if you've had any connection with the person, or know the person, or any relation to the person, and things. And that's just nowhere near the situation that we've got here. It was interesting because Keith has previously called standards hearings a kangaroo court, and he was lambasted for that. And yet when the boot was on the other foot, and Councillor Longdon, which has been talked about at that council meeting about being under standards, he called it a kangaroo court. And you can't have it both ways.
Item on the agenda,
yes, it is about standards, absolutely. What we've got here in front of us and things, because we've got to have it so that it's absolutely fine. I don't think councillors who have a complaint against them should actually be named to the independent person.
Thank you, Mrs. Conde. And the second speaker is Councillor Conde.
Come darker, please.
Come darker, sorry.
Thank you. In this report on page 39, it says leadership and culture. A council that has repeated complaints, usually 10 or so a year, has got cultural and leadership problems. If I've got a problem with this council, it has been for years ignored. Problems over air quality, problems over planning. Anything I do always gets ignored. And then I say something on social media, one sentence or whatever, and then I get hauled before the courts of the council for immoral or socially unacceptable behaviour maybe, or sub-criminal behaviour. I've always stood up for my residents. I've stood up for my residents on issues about planning. We had a planning issue where documents were changed, and I was hauled up for sending an email to actually tell someone not to agree felling a tree on election
Would you stick to
day.
the item that we are discussing, please?
I am. I'm giving
You're
examples.
talking about planning, councillor. Can you
I'm
talk to the
talking
item
about
in front of you?
items where I have been censured for poor behaviour. I have. We have to have fair trials, and one of the issues is the council standard procedure decides what is being discussed inside a standard meeting, and that may very well be decided that it's procedural. Did I follow the procedures, rather than is what Keith says is true. However, when a sanction is put upon me, it is decided what I said was lying, inaccurate, etc., when that wasn't actually tested by the standards hearing. And this is why it's really important that standards hearings, if the person accused wants, are held in public. Because then the public not only would see the decision of the standards hearing, but also my evidence, what I was allowed to say at standards hearing, and what was ruled out of order. It is also said in here about the sanctions against councillors and whether we should lose 6 months' pay or whatever. That should be a decision for the electorate. The electorate, as long as what I'm doing is perfectly legal, as long as what I'm doing is in the interest of the public I serve, it should be for a court, if I'm doing anything wrong. Any councillors allowed to take me to court, officers, the council can take me to court, but it should not be for the council to decide I don't get 6
You're
months.
talking on a personal basis rather than to the actual issue that was in front
I
of
have
us.
been before 6 standards hearings. I have effectively been named in this report, and my party, the Green Party, has given me massive support because the things I've been discussing.
But this has nothing to do with the report in front of us, councillor Condical. Can you please stick to the report or stop speaking?
The report mentions
Thank you.
my party. Thank you.
Right, we will move to any points anyone wishes to raise. Councillor Pomfret.
Philip did get on to this towards the end of what he had to say. As you pointed out, Philip, the government have got other things on its mind at the moment. Have you got any indication of what priority changes to legislation might have at the moment?
Not at the moment, Chairman.
Thank you. And can I just clarify, this executive summary and the priorities, incorporating or the best practice, this is a government document, is it? Or from,
This is from the committee.
from the committee. It's nothing to do with the Borough Council.
No,
these
no,
things
no,
now.
from the committee.
Thank you.
Councillor Trone.
Thank you, Chair. Director Richardson mentioned something quite important there about independent persons and the fact that they, if they stay in the job too long, they may not remain independent. And if there's problems recruiting, how you deal with that, and you explained one possible way of doing that. I would suggest that industry best practice in the commercial world would be a tremendous advantage if we applied that. And basically there, in a similar situation, there would be a series of calibration exercises done on a quarterly, annual or an annual basis or biannual basis with these independent people, so that they were all being given test cases to look at, and they would give their views and they would talk about it between themselves. They haven't even got to meet up, you can do it by a conference call, and that way they're all singing off the same hymn sheet. They're all taking a similar view of similarly serious matters. And there aren't any maverick cases where somebody could turn around and say, oh, because I went to independent person number 4 or 5, because they've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, they're a bit jaded, and so they've treated me more harshly than I should have been, or they were treated too leniently. By doing these kind of calibration exercises, it keeps them all roughly in tune, while still allowing some scope for their personal views. And I think if the borough and the other 4 councils you mentioned were to go ahead in the way you described, I think we would want to see some kind of calibration exercise there to keep them all fresh and to keep them all, being broadly compatible. The other couple of points I'd like to make, one of the speakers referred to on page 38, any standards process needs to have safeguards in place, all the rest of it. The important bit of that paragraph is the independent person is important in safeguarding the current system. So this isn't a question that before things get taken forward, there hasn't been an independent and objective person look at things. There has been, and they have made a view. And that's central to this, and that's central to what the government is saying should continue. So to turn around and say, oh, they're all against me, well, that might be or may not be the case. But when it goes to an independent person to consider and then make recommendations, and it's that independent person's recommendations that have been followed, it's very hard to argue against that. And you have to doubt the motives of anyone that would say that. The other thing that I found extremely surprising was references to bullying. I'm sorry, but the attitude that if somebody is doing something criminal, they should be taken to court. Well, I'm afraid bullying isn't always criminal. It doesn't always meet that standard of assault or whatever. But employees have rights, and I think we're all very glad that they do have rights. So they can't be screamed at. They can't be threatened with their jobs. They can't have all sorts of things happen to them. As a corporate entity, the council has a responsibility to protect its employees, and I'm very glad about that. So turning around and saying, oh, just because you can't prove I've broken the law, anything else goes.
That is not what
Can
was
you-
It's any amount of bullying.
Can you stick to me? You're straying a little from the
Yeah,
item.
it's just, I think, the sub-criminal is very clearly a label that is referred to in here, and correctly so, because there may be a whole bunch of scenarios where an employee or a councillor or whoever is accused of, as we just said, bullying or whatever, where actually it hasn't breached the criminal law, but it is unacceptable in the standards of employment law, and is unacceptable in a civil way, or is unacceptable in the standards of decent behaviour and the standards in public life. So I think sub-criminal can be applied to that. I think, as it pretty much says in here, it can reasonably be applied to anything that is ongoing harassment that wouldn't meet the police's fairly high bar of reaching the level at which a criminal action would be taken. It doesn't mean that it's any less unpleasant. And it doesn't mean it's the kind of thing that the council should have to tolerate and that people should get away with just because they think they can. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any further?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I would like to echo what Councillor Tromity said about the calibration exercise. It's very important. And equally that we, if possible, apply some sort of moderation process afterwards, where we talk about benchmarking against other bodies in the initial setup. Then perhaps we can moderate our complaints against other councils locally to see that we're arriving at similar sort of outcomes for similar type of complaints, and that way we know that we're operating here, after the event, as it were, in line with what other councils are applying, and we make sure we're applying the same standards to the same level, and that we're coming to broadly the same conclusions for similar type of offences.
Thank you. Are there any, any further comments? And as far as a comment goes in relation to what Councillor Tromans and Councillor Brown have said, I do think when this comes back, and if there is a change to how independents are appointed, if we can find them in the first place, then it is important that they are well aware of the job that they are supposed to do and that they are capable of doing it. I think that's very important. If there are no more speakers, I will move to the recommendation, and I am going to make a slight change to it, and it will say the Director, Arts, Leisure and Democracy undertake the proposed benchmarking exercise against the best practice standards in consultation with the Chair and report the outcome to the next meeting of the committee. when it says in consultation with the chair, I would like to add and a member of the opposition. If that is an acceptable addition to the recommendation. Everyone happy with that? So when it comes back, whoever is the chair will need to decide who that person is. Right then, thank you for that. We then move on to agenda item 11, I think. To agenda item 11. I do hope that the extra paperwork that was sent out, the coloured copy, was perhaps a little more helpful to members because the original one was a little difficult to understand. So,
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, and apologies. Obviously, when we do these things with track changes, it goes into wonderful Technicolor, which means when it's printed black and white, it doesn't always come out as clearly as it would otherwise do. So the Chair did ask, and I hope you've all had a copy of the Technicolor version, which shows you the changes that have been made. I think, Chair, perhaps the easiest thing to do is to just work through the appendix, because I think there's lots of proposed changes here, which have been through the Constitution Review Working Party. And I have to say, Chair, that across the piece, for the majority of these items were approved unanimously, with the exception of a small bit, which I think Councillor Longden objected to, and I'll explain that when we get to it. The first, and probably, I know it's potentially a controversial change, but it's one that did meet with approval, and I'll explain the rationale in a moment. Was in connection with members' questions, and you'll see on page 56 of the agenda papers that the proposal is to move members' questions to the very end of an ordinary meeting of the committee, of council, sorry. There's and if I put it in these terms, the last meeting of council, we had quite an important item on the agenda. We had the petition from the Bolkington residents, and by the time we got to it, I think it must have been getting upwards for 11:30 in the evening. And a sizable chunk, probably about an hour of the evening, was taken up with members' questions. Now, not by any means belittling members' questions, but they do tend to be rather focused and specific and of interest, particularly to members, but not necessarily to the public. And I think there was a view that it might be better if we're going to have arguments in the chamber, that we have those once we've dealt with the business that the public might actually be interested in hearing. That's not to say that members of the public are interested in hearing questions, it's just that I'm sure there are other things that they're there for as well. So the working party did suggest, Chair, and I think the model that we were replicating was that from the County Council, where they moved their members' questions to later in the agenda, so that the business of the day can be dealt with first. So that's the first suggested change. I don't know, Chair, do you want me to go through the whole lot and then...
Well, if people want to stop on one specific item that we're talking about, say so. Otherwise, I'll just let Philip continue through and assume that no one wants to comment on that particular part of the...
I'm conscious that we have speakers though, Chair.
Oh yes, you do have speakers. I'm sorry, I missed that out. I think we have Mrs.
Philip to go through all the changes first.
Pardon?
Easy for Philip to go through.
Well, no, because if you were speakers, you were speaking at the start of the debate.
Well, I can do the report, Chair, but it will be quite lengthy.
Okay, go on then.
Okay, right, we'll carry on then. The next change, Chair, and it's not a deletion, it looks like a deletion, but on page 58, where it talks about public participation at extraordinary meetings, it looks like we've taken that away. We haven't. But what we have done is we've inserted it into public participation on page 59, The rationale for that was that when it was initially put into the agenda, because we didn't have that before extraordinary meetings, the public couldn't actually speak at extraordinary meetings, there was no filtering mechanism, which we felt at the working party it was sensible to have public speaking at extraordinary meetings, but actually have the same procedure that people have to submit what they're proposing to say or any question that they want to ask, so that there's time either to prepare an answer, because of course we won't know what they're going to say necessarily, or alternatively that Brent as head of paid service can ensure that he's not going to be frivolous, vexatious, defamatory or what have you. So by moving it into the provisions on page 59 just enables us to then apply the normal standard of assessment that would apply to questions. So just to reassure members, we're not saying we're not having public speaking at extraordinary meetings, but we are saying, but we will have the usual filters in place. Turning over then, Chair, to page 60, there are two proposed changes on page 16. The first is that in 4.9.4 you will see that, and you'll have to forgive me because I was asked to do this, to come up with a definition of a question for the purposes of these procedure rules. And the proposal that was accepted by the review working party for consideration today and ultimately by council was that a question would be a small paragraph of no more than 3 sentences with the purpose of seeking information on a single matter. Ironically, I've also, since John Burko's announcement yesterday, I've been looking at the parliamentary rules as well. It's interesting to see what they do about questions, as well as what they do about previous motions. So that was that for suggestion on questions, and the principal reason for that is to try and focus questions and to keep them, relatively speaking, short. That's not to presume that you can't have a preamble, but to try and limit the length. As you know, we've had some questions that have been a page and a half long, which is basically a statement with a question mark at the end, and I think the view was that that's probably taking up too much time. What we really want to do is to encourage questions from the public, in particular, which are much more focused on the issue that they actually want an answer to. And similarly, Chair, in 4.9.4, there's a definition of a statement, which is basically an expression of opinion. So, it doesn't require an answer. It's not seeking an answer. It is simply expressing a view from a member of the public, in this case, to an issue that's relevant to either the proceedings at an extraordinary council or generally on something that affects the borough, which we would positively encourage members of the public to do, to engage with that. The only other thing to say is that there is, obviously we've reduced the period for responses because, as you know, 20 minutes is allowed for questions and statements. So we've said that responses should be no more than 3 minutes, so we've reduced it from 5 in order to try and get through the business. And the only other thing to flag, and it's just above 4.9.4, is that the head of paid service needs to have the ability to be able to rule out a question or statement that doesn't comply. And what would that, by ruling out, that would normally mean that we would contact the person who submitted it and say, it doesn't comply for the following reasons, you need to amend it in this way, and then send it. And as long as it's done before the time limit, then it will go in. We've done that. I have to say that does happen already. So it's not a quantum shift, but it is trying to narrow down and focus so that we can deal with business in a more effective way. The other change, Chair, is in 4.9.6, and that is in council procedure rules. It talks about drawing lots. What we actually do is we deal with questions on a first come first served basis. So they're done, because they usually come in by email, we can see when they've come in, we can see, and we will deal with them in the order in which they are received, and that's how we've tended to do it. So that's just tidied up to reflect the actual process that we follow in 4.9.6. That's on page 60. On page 61, it's just to make the point that members' questions will also comply with those definitions of what's a question. So members will also be 3 sentences with the intention of with the question, really, you're looking for an answer to something. The next change, Chair, is the deletion, and this is in both public and members' questions, of the supplementary. Again, I think when we first started on the discussion on this, the working party and a little bit, but I think they came to the conclusion that as time is precious and limited, we so rarely have supplementaries now that actually, is there any point in keeping it in? If members wish to debate a matter, then of course what they could do is they could put a motion on the agenda if that was the case. So the proposal is to delete the supplementaries simply because we haven't had one. And I think it was Councillor Wilson who said he can't remember the last time it was a supplementary, and I have to say I'm not entirely sure I can remember when the last time it was supplementary.
Chair, may I intervene? It might be helpful. I mean, I think we've all read this in a fair bit of detail, most of us. Is there anyone that it might be more helpful if there were particular points on here that members wanted to ask about?
Well, I think the reason that Mr Richardson is going through it is because I have 2 speakers who have to speak at the start of the debate.
Right.
So we have to go through the report
Okay.
to enable them to speak. I take the point you're making, but that's the reason why we're going through it.
Thank you, Chair. And we are probably moving to probably the more contentious areas. So paragraph 62. Sorry, page 62. Thank you, Chair. And there is we introduced the proposals that were at 4.10.5 about 2 years ago, and that was prior to that there was no provision for debating questions. We, as a result of that, increased the period of time for members' questions from 20 minutes to 45 minutes to allow time for debate. I think the general view now is that that's becoming quite obstructive to getting to the council's business. So the recommendation is that we just take that out and we go back to, we rewind the clock a couple of years and we go back to where we were back in 2016, 2017. Moving on, Chair, to page 65. And again, this is clarification rather than anything new. There is a suggestion, and obviously the mayor is on the working party, so he's quite keen on this one. That where members are deviating from the topic, and by the topic I mean if there's a motion being debated, there is a tendency in some, on occasions I shall say, for members to slightly divert onto other matters, and the mayor will endeavour to bring them back into line, but that doesn't always receive shall we say, a joyous response from the member who may well be mid-sentence at the time. There is provision already in procedure rules for this, but I think the committee the panel were very keen to just reiterate that the procedure rules are there. So we're making reference to procedure rule 4.19.3. So we've been asked to put that in just to remind members that if they are not complying with the mayor's request, then they are at risk. that the mayor does have the power to move from the chair, that may not be heard further. It's rarely used, but I think certainly from what I understand from the mayor, we've got close on a couple of occasions. Similarly, on page 65, paragraph E, and this was a specific request from Councillor Wilson in particular, who raised this with me long before a year or so ago, which was in connection with being obviously the principal opposition speaker, that when he speaks, he only gets, under the procedure rules, he only gets the opportunity to speak once. So if he speaks and moves an amendment, that's it, he only gets one go, so he gets his 5 minutes, if you like. And he questioned whether it was fair and reasonable in those circumstances. So we've agreed that as long as he doesn't speak on the main motion, so if he speaks to move an amendment and doesn't speak on the main motion, that he then has the right to speak on the motion if the amendment that he's moved is lost. So it gives him a second bite on the main motion. Moving on, Chair. Points of order. At 4:13:12, point of order. This is a procedural change at first, and that is that, as we do with points of further explanation, that a member will signal to say they have a point of order, but it will be taken at the end of the members who is speaking at the time. That's principally because we're getting to a point where members are struggling to get their speech in because of the number of points of orders and interruptions. It disrupts the flow. It also, because we do stop the clock, but we can't guarantee that a member actually gets their full 5 minutes. So it's in fairness to that. So that is there. And then one of the questions that the Mayor was very keen on, and I think it's probably right, that any advice that the Mayor gets is advice to the Mayor. The Mayor is then required to make a determination on the advice. So it's just reinforcing the point that is, and that whatever the Mayor's decision is, and it's already in the Constitution, the Mayor's decision is final on the point. There shouldn't be any debate, any argument, that's it. If people are not happy with the decision of the Mayor, they need to take that up with the Mayor outside of the meeting. But it's just to reinforce the point. The Mayor, once they've made a determination, that is it. That is their role as Mayor. And sorry, Chair, I've just jumped a little bit. The bit that in B and C and Roman 1 and 2, just above 4:13:12 on that page, you'll see that we have said, and this relates back to a change that we're going to come to in a little while. We have got into the habit of having recorded votes on procedural motions. And the suggestion is that what we will do is we will rule out recorded votes on procedural motions, so closure motions, which are those there, but we will record the decision of the Mayor as to whether or not he feels that, or she feels that it has been, the item has been adequately debated, and therefore they're going to move the procedural motion to a vote.
Yeah.
So again, it's really just trying to streamline the procedure. As you know, you can have a recorded vote on a motion anyway. So what we're having is a procedural motion on, a recorded vote on a procedural motion, followed by a recorded vote on the motion itself. So we're forever going through this process, but it all takes time and it just prolongs the meeting. And we're suggesting that it's a procedural motion. No decision turns on it beyond the fact that you're going to a vote or you're going to do something. So at which point it would then be legitimate to have a recorded vote. So when we come to it, I'll point that out.
But the vote is still recorded.
But the vote would, but certainly in terms of the recorded vote on the final motion, that would be recorded as that. And of course, members can still have their vote recorded in the minutes at their request in any event. Points of personal explanation, that's just to clarify that we take those at the end so that they don't disrupt the flow. That's been the case now for some time. And then over the page 70, you'll see there C, there'll be no recorded vote for any disclosure motions under Procedure Rule 413.11. So that's that. It just tidies that up. The next change is on 71 at 419.3, and the only change there is the words, although it looks like the whole thing's been changed, it's actually just the addition of the words "or challenges." So we have "or challenges" added into 419.3, just to make that clear, and then we've tidied up 419.4 in terms of the relationship between that and the previous motion in terms of that council not being heard further. And then lastly, Chair, by no means least, on page 74, we are proposing to allow for substitutes of regulatory and this committee in 423.1, and that is what 23.1 and 3 seek to do. And Chair, that is it.
Okay. Right, I have two speakers. Mrs. Conduct, please.
Thank you. There are a lot of changes and bits and bobs in here, so I'll try and get as much covered as I can. First thing I actually want to say is not actually a change that thing, but it says approve the accuracy of the minutes of the last meeting. Now there have been numerous occasions recently where someone has said, oh no, that wasn't accurate, that's something, and then it's been voted on and things, and either the minutes are accurate or they're not accurate. And as someone sitting in the public gallery, I find that absolutely unbelievable that that can be voted on, and something that is blatantly wrong can then be accepted and signed into the minutes. So I think that is something that should actually be looked at, please. In other things, you mentioned that the public aren't as interested in the questions and things. Actually, I think that is one of the bits that the public are actually, more interested in. So I am quite concerned that that's going to the end of the meeting. I absolutely agree that meetings need to be made shorter and things. I mean, I have given up on the ones that go through to 11, whatever and things, and how anyone can be having a good debate and making good decisions after a 5-hour meeting when they've had a full day at work. I just can't believe that it can happen. So, I'm all in sort of favour of some of these changes to make things a little bit shorter. In terms of, it keeps referring to head of paid service. I find that a very, very strange term and things, because I don't actually know who that refers to. We don't have anyone in the council who's, known by that title and things. So I think that should actually be changed to executive director or whatever the term is. I think from what you said that refers to Brent. Yeah, but I mean, I read that and thought, well, who is that? I thought that was removing, but you've already clarified that that's not. Scope of questions. I sometimes wonder why things aren't actually already rejected and people are actually allowed to answer questions. So I think that actually needs to be the questions need to be looked at. Back in about 18 months ago, I had a question rejected because it said it had actually two questions in it. It was rejected, and because I happened to be out, I didn't get that message until after the deadline, and I wasn't allowed to ask the question at all, rather than saying you can only ask half the question. Things, and yet subsequent to that, loads of people have had ones that have got 2 questions in and things. So I think if any of these rules, they do need to be actually evenly applied, because they're not big. And similarly with this about the content and length of speech, it's about the mayor being able to stop a member from speaking if they deviate and things. Sitting in the public gallery, that is not evenly applied. I have seen it, the mayor definitely allowing Labour members to speak and deviate and what have you and things, but members of the opposition parties...
Councillor, Mrs. Carter, call your Your time is up. Thank you. Councillor Crondicle.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start at the point about deviation. It is really important we don't talk about totally different subjects. If I start to talk about giraffes now, you'll tell me off. But we do need to be able to talk around the subject and about if there's a, say, a Tory motion, how that compares to the Labour motion. So I'm very frightened that the next mayor and future mayors may use the deviation rule to actually stop us having sensible debates. If we have 3 minutes to speak, we should be allowed to talk on the subject for 3 minutes. We shouldn't be able to talk about a different subject. Totally accepted. We should be kept on track. But if it is deviate from the question, then actually a single word difference and a very malicious mayor could actually really stop anyone talking. It could be like an intellectual game to make sure that you don't fall foul of the deviation rule. So I think the deviation rule does need to be worded in a way that lets us have a sensible debate about a subject. And when you become an opposition group and then you become in power, whatever rule you do today, it's going to be, you're going to face it when the opposite party has a mayor. So I think that rule needs to be written carefully so that we can actually talk sensibly about a motion rather than it being a rule that continuously means that people are interrupted. I'm very concerned about questions. As a councillor that's not allowed on internal scrutiny, audit or any other internal body, the only chance I've got to ask questions is at full council. With just 20 minutes for questions and 4 or 5 minutes taken up in each question. That means there's only going to be probably 2 opposition questions. If the controlling group has 2 questions, in the 20 minutes we're only going to have 2 questions from the opposition groups, which means I may very well go half a year without being able to ask a question, which is very poor representation. You mentioned the county council. I asked 3 questions at the county council this afternoon and a supplementary. They're overly generous at the county council. I think asking 1 or 2 questions per year is going too far the other way. And I really think that, I understand why we don't want these mini debates, because they really do muck things up. But to actually have only 2 opposition questions in a meeting is going to be a serious problem. And I think the best way of dealing with it is the questions should have the shortest questions first. Because that means that if we've only got a limited amount of time, people will answer short questions. Because this rule about who puts the question in first, we can have all our questions blocked by the controlling group just asking loads of questions 2 or 3 months early. And I do have issues sometimes with questions from the controlling group, which then the cabinet member can say something about me. So member A can ask the cabinet member, do you think Keith wants to build behind his house? The cabinet member can say X and I can't reply. So there does need to be that issue sorted. Thank you, Chair.
Right, so we'll then move into debate. It would be useful when people speak if you could just direct us to the number of the or the paragraph with the number on it as to where you wish to speak to, so we're not constantly ruffling papers trying to find it. So, any questions? Councillor Chairman.
I don't have questions. I've got some comments to make,
Well.
Chair, if that's in order. I've made some detailed notes on this, but yeah, Director Richardson did go through the whole thing again, and it did remind me of a couple of things that I haven't noted down, despite running on to 25 bullet points. There are a couple of things in here which seem worthy enough. The right to substitute members on all committees, that seems to make sense. When moving an amendment, not losing your right to speak on the main motion, that seems just like democracy to me. I don't agree with some of the comments that have been made. These mini debates that muck things up, I don't think they do. I think that's called democracy, and I love it. I think getting rid of debates and motions in response to questions would be a retrograde step. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that I really don't like. Some of it is very, very draconian. Being able to be silenced because you've questioned the mayor. Nobody, and I mean this sincerely, wants to give mayors a hard time. but what needs to happen is for it to be completely transparent what's going on. So if there's a mumble conversation and the mayor says, oh right, well, we're moving on, and the public's all going, what's going on now? The video doesn't know either, so anyone watching that isn't going to know. So it's going to get challenged. Exactly what are you doing? What are you saying? Why are you making that decision? You need to be transparent. And if mayors aren't comfortable about justifying their decision, then people are clearly going to question that. There's a whole bunch of other things in here which I really, removing the discretion for supplementary questions. My understanding is that, even Tower Hamlets has that now, after they had the government inspectors in. So, we need to at least retain that ability. If we are running out of time in meetings, then maybe there should be more council meetings, and maybe they should be conducted in a more genteel fashion. I think we would all be in favour of that. I just don't think that 90% plus of this is stuff that I could agree to, and I would want to conduct meetings that way. It might be nice to think, if you were a mayor or whatever, that it would be a very simple meeting to run because you can just silence everyone that you don't agree with for the rest of the meeting. But I just, I don't think we should have that ability. I don't think a lot of mayors would want to use it anyway, but I don't think we should be putting that kind of ability in here. So frankly, rather than try and amend 95% of this, I personally would not want to support the recommendation. I think some good work's been done here and some stuff's a bit debatable, but a lot of it I'm very uncomfortable with, and I think this needs to go back to the working party, and this should not proceed any further. This shouldn't go to full council. I wouldn't be happy to vote in favour of this moving forward to the Cabinet or Council. I think this needs to go back to the Constitutional Working Party Chair. In fact, I'd like to move that, if I may.
Second that.
Anyone else wishes to speak? Carl?
Sorry, is this on the amendment, Chair, or the...
Sorry, Chair.
I haven't yet moved the proposal.
So it's a motion.
It's
So
a motion.
if I could just get the wording right, and then
I'll leave it to your expert scribing ability, Philip. But
the
gist of it being, I don't think this should proceed to the Cabinet or Council. As it stands, it should go back to the Constitutional Working Committee or the committee it came from.
Appendix A be referred back to the Constitutional Review Working Party.
There seems to be just two items in there that have merit: the moving amendment and being able to speak on the main motion after, and substituting other members on committees. I'm comfortable with. Everything else gives me some concerns, and I think I've talked about it with some of my colleagues then too.
So and for the working party
to reconsider the document. Maybe if they just dropped out all the other bits, left those two in, it could come back straight away. I don't know. That's for them to sort out.
Councillor Croft, second.
Any further speak? Carl?
So are we speaking on the amendment?
Well, it's the motion.
The motion. Yeah, okay, I'll speak on this. I agree with the motion that Councillor Tromans has put forward. I do think that a lot of things that have been put forward do need to be reconsidered. Don't get me wrong, there's some parts of this that I quite like. Substitutes being allowed on regulatory committees, and for me, I'm not a member of a scrutiny panel, and under this I'd be able to sit on a working party if I wanted to. So is that later on? That's later. That's not part. Okay, right. Anyway, I'll move on. There's a number of things that I've got quite a few concerns about. Supplementary questions. I think it's unfortunate that mayors over recent years have stopped councillors from asking supplementary questions, and I think that's one of the reasons why questions at present are so long, because members need to ensure that they get all of their points across. So I think going to the extent of basically banning supplementary questions is just not on. Councillor Tromans referred to Tower Hamlets. He's absolutely right. I've printed off the part of the Constitution here from Tower Hamlets London Borough Council. highlighted below. Even Tower Hamlets allow supplementary questions. So I think it would be really embarrassing that, you know, if this was to go through, that, you know, Nuneaton and Bedworth has stopped supplementary questions.
What is the link to Tower Hamlets specifically than any other council in the country?
I think they're a byword for just how bad councils can be.
I
Just
just,
the government have to step in.
well, I mean, okay, no, well, I'll carry on, but to be fair, if you could possibly go away, Chair, and find a council in the country that has stopped councillors from asking supplementary questions, or it's not part of the constitution, if you could come back to the committee and give a list of councils that do that, then that would be appreciated, because I don't think you'll find one that has stopped supplementary questions. Limiting questions to 3 sentences. I do accept that questions need to be a lot shorter. I recall Councillor Beaumont's question many months ago, where he wanted to quote a parliamentary report. Like I said, I think they need to be shorter, but I think limiting questions to just 3 sentences is a bit draconian. With regards to stopping recorded votes for procedural motions, that's something that I can't support, because at the end of the day, my residents have a right to know how I vote, and if they can't see it in the council minutes, the only way that they could possibly see how I vote on a procedural motion is by looking at the video, and there's a fairly good chance that the video would have technical difficulties, so they might not be able to see that part. At the end of the day, I mean, I suspect this is come forward because a few members want to try and save time, but at the end of the day, you could just have 34 members stand up, make a point of order and say, well, I want my vote recorded, so you're not really saving a lot of time, really. You might as well just allow the recorded vote. Motions after questions. I'm interested that this is being taken out, Chair, because I believe it was your idea in the first place. So I'd be quite interested in knowing why, as Chair of the Constitutional Review Working Party, you believe this should be taken out. I've got 2 questions.
It wasn't my idea, I wasn't on there in the first place, Councillor. Get your facts right.
I retract that. I was told otherwise. I do apologise. I retract that. So members' question time is maximum of 24 minutes.
24 minutes, yes.
24
Well,
under the amendment.
We
Yeah.
changed it to 24
Yeah.
because it evened up with
Yeah.
the 6 minutes question and answer.
So that's based on 4 questions.
So you've got the question.
So that's based on 4 questions.
Assuming they take up 3 minutes, 6
Wow.
minutes for
Sorry,
each
just to be
question.
clear, Chair, it was 20 minutes.
Yes, and it's going to 24.
So, and that was based on 5 minutes.
Yeah. So I just wondered why it was 24. It's just a bit of an odd figure.
It's just kept it consistent with what it
Yeah.
used to be.
Okay, and just one question to you, Director Richardson. If a motion is passed where a member is not heard, where does that, if there was a future recorded vote, would the member be allowed to speak if they're for or against?
It doesn't prevent them from voting, Chair, but it will prevent them from speaking
On future motions. Right, okay.
But that isn't a change to the Constitution.
No, but it's just, but it has been clarified in the proposed amendment, so I just wanted to clarify that, Chair. I mean, I can't support a lot of these amendments, and that's why I'll be supporting Councillor Troman's motion. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Paragraph 4.9.4. This is one I have some serious issues with, really. As we all know, I mean, questions do need to be concise and to the point. But there will be occasions when the nature of a question means that it might grammatically be more than 3 sentences. Now, I work in a legal department. I can write 3 sentences that can take up 150 pages if you really want me to. I appreciate the difficulties that you've had, but I would ask you to go away and reconsider that, because, quite frankly, we can drive a coach and horses through that if people choose to be pedantic about it, really.
You need a lot of colons.
Yes.
Does anyone else have any comments they wish to make? Councillor Pomfret.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know how many times the Review Working Party met, but obviously their time has been wasted really, because it's although they all supported it, it seems that quite a lot of councillors here don't. I do understand it was a cross-party working party. I'm just wondering why at this point all these objections have been found. When it comes to what full council is for, well, is it to make decisions or is it to have a debate? Well, I would put making decisions above having a debate. Perhaps I'm just being, rather strange, but that's what I always thought full council was for. Debates do go on in full council, quite rightly too, but there are also lots of other forums in which decisions, proposals, recommendations, etc., can be debated before they get to full council. I mean, if you watch a video of, if you have got really a sad life, and you do watch a full council, you've got nothing else to do. It is an absolutely mind-destroying experience. If I'm a member of the general public, I would never consider it, although I do have a friend who has it on instead of radio too when he's working. And he thinks it's hilarious that it takes us so long to get so short a distance. Mayor's powers, I understand that most of these so-called mayor's powers aren't really mayor's powers at all. Most of them, perhaps we'll have some clarification on this, they do need to go to the vote.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So are there any instances where the mayor can just say, right, you can't speak anymore, we're going to carry on and not seek the support of the meeting, or are there any circumstances in which that can happen?
The only aspect, and that's as we are now. I mean, nothing in that respect is changing.
No.
But on closure motions, the mayor has to consider whether or not the motion has been sufficiently debated. And then, as you'll see, it says, and if he does or she does think that to be the case, then it goes to the council on a closure motion, and council will make the decision whether to close the motion. So, in that respect, it's the decision of the meeting, not the mayor.
That's what I thought.
There is just one part where the mayor can stop, and that is if the mayor chooses to suspend the meeting. That is the mayor's decision.
So just shut down
Yes.
for adjournment
Well,
or
suspend
permanent
or
for
shut
that
down.
day or whatever?
That is also in these papers, and that is the only time the mayor can actually shut down a meeting or suspend a meeting. That's it already in there. Any further speakers?
On the supplementary questions, I really don't think that taking out supplementary questions is going to help the quality of debate, because it's already very stilted in a lot of council meetings, especially at question time, when it effectively becomes reading out of a script. So it'll be much less free-flowing. Now, when Director Richardson was talking about the fact that he said, what did you say, Director Richardson, it was most of the proposals were agreed unanimously by the working party? is that what you
Yes,
said?
well, yes.
He's come into the room since then, but you said that Councillor Wilson said that he can't remember the last time that a supplementary question has been granted. I've never heard him say that with approval, just to put that on the record. But I do think that the solution is to go the other way and to try and make supplementary questions much more standard, because that, as well as improving the quality of debate, and debate are important because it is the forum for the borough, it would help the quality of governance as well, because it would make sure that the portfolio holders are very much on top of their brief. Not to say that they're not, but for the same reason we have questions without notice in the Parliament, is that they have to be across everything and have to be ready for anything that comes up. And you don't quite get that effect with questions that are, and answers that are written out beforehand. And the other point I was going to make was on points of order, which is that if you hear a point of order at the end of a speech rather than during it, surely if something is out of order, you are allowing disorder to continue throughout that speech. And I'm not sure that would be very good for the operation of the council. Those are the points I was going to make.
Well, in my view, if a point of order, if a point of order is raised and it is noted, and then it is it is taken at the end. The point of order is not going to stop the person speaking when they start speaking again. They're still going to continue speaking.
It might affect what they're saying, because we've had several points where we've had points of order about keeping on topic.
That issue, okay, carry on.
I've said what I was going to say.
Thank you. Come on.
Well, what I was going to say, Chair, was in terms of points of order, you are right. I mean, the reason that they would ordinarily take the church away is if there was a breach of the law, or you felt there was a breach of the law, then you would take it straight away. However, the nature of points of order at Nuneaton Bedworth, I don't think yet we've had a member raise a point of order where there is, with the exception of Nick Grant, he did raise one, we've never had an issue raised where if the member was to finish the speech, it would have been led to a breach of the rules or a breach of illegality, or breach of, or an illegal statement, shall we say.
Okay. Are there any further speakers?
So this, obviously before the working party was working group was cross-party, and I presume that's been brought to committee now because it was a unanimous decision of approval of what was in here. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I raised the point of what's going to be gained by it going back.
Councillor Evans.
Sorry,
Yeah, that's one. Yeah.
can you just confirm, did you say that it was a unanimous vote in favour of this, of the
Yes.
amendments? So it was every
At the
single
end,
member?
let me explain what happened at the meeting, Councillor Evans. We had the report from the previous meeting, and we went through the report, and we looked at it all again. There were some amendments to the original report from February, I believe. This was in March. And at the end of the discussions, where some of the things were changed, I, as the chair, went round every single member in the meeting, that was myself plus 4 others, and asked if they agreed with what we had decided. And they all said yes. I can't be any fairer than that.
Oh, no, fair enough, Chair. I'm just asking you and 4 others, was the meeting a couple light then? I thought there was more than that on it.
There was 6, there was, let me go around. There was myself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us, sorry, I wasn't counting myself. There was myself, Councillor Smith, Councillor Watkins, Councillor Longdon, Councillor Jackson and Councillor Wilson.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. I think the point of it having to come here to answer the councillor's question is if the working party could decide these things without referring it on, then that would be the procedure. The reason it's come to us is for us to have a second look, and that's what I've done. You know, as I say, there's a couple of things in there I like, particularly the thing that Director Richardson said that Councillor Wilson has raised for a long time about not being able to speak, and that would go for whoever was the leader of the opposition. And also substitute, which is not unrelated to council meetings, substituting members on committees. You know, that all seems great, but the rest of it, I think, having had a cool reflection of this, it seems like
I mean, other than
a number
one or
of us
two
don't like
items,
it.
what you're saying, Councillor Tromans, is that you disagree with all of the changes.
No, the 2 I like, but the other ones give me a lot of concerns, and cool reflection, I think they give others concerns as well, and hence I move the motion.
Okay, I don't see the point in it going back to the working party when they've already had 2 meetings to decide what they're doing. So you have moved, if there are no more speakers, you have moved a proposal, Councillor Tromans, that the document goes back to the working party for them to reconsider the decisions that they have made. I'm not happy with it going back to the working party because we have spent a total of, I would suspect, around about 4.5 hours discussing it anyway, so I am going to recommend to put in an amendment that the matter be referred to full council. Is there a seconder?
I'll second that, Chair.
I think, Chair, that might
Negate.
negate.
Okay,
What you would do, Chair, is vote against,
okay,
and then
right.
if the
Fair
motion
comment.
falls, then you could move a different
Okay,
motion.
right. So we will move
John
to the, my apologies, we will move to the proposal. All those in
Can I
favour?
call for a recorded vote on this, please, Chair?
Just on that point, when you say that people wouldn't know how you vote, your residents wouldn't know how you voted, could you just tell them how you voted?
That's not the point though, is it, Chair? You know,
Well, that's what I do with my residents. I don't ask them to look for a recorded vote, but there you go.
Before we do, Chair, just for the sake of completeness, could I have 3 members to stand? Just thank you. Thanks, Chair. Just getting the membership correct. Okay, so the motion is that the Appendix 8 be referred back to the Constitution Review Working Party to reconsider the document, moved by Councillor Truman, seconded by Councillor Croft. So if I can ask members to say whether they're for or against that motion. So Councillor Brown?
For.
Councillor Croft?
For.
Councillor Daffin?
Against.
Councillor Doughty's absent. Councillor Evans?
for.
Councillor Hocking?
Against.
Councillor Pomfret?
Against.
Councillor Sargent? For. Councillor Tandy?
Against?
And Councillor Trones?
For.
And Councillor Rudkin?
Against.
And it's tied 5-5, Chair, so it's casting vote.
My casting vote will be against.
So that is lost. So we now need a new motion to be moved.
I will move a motion that the changes to our constitution is referred to the amendment to the sorry. That the amendments to the council procedure rules be referred to full council.
And that the amendment, the constitution be amended.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's as printed,
And,
Chair.
and as printed.
As printed.
Could I call for a recorded vote on that? Vote, please.
Thank you.
Just before we do, can you just run us through, Director Richardson, about the casting votes? We understand the mayoral casting vote.
The chair, all chairs of committees have a casting vote where the vote is tied across the meeting. It's exactly the same as it is with the mayor. So, just to be clear, the recommendation is as printed, 2.1, 2.2 on page 53. So if I can ask members to say whether they're for or against the motion. So, Councillor Brown?
Against.
Councillor Croft?
Against.
Councillor Daffin?
For.
Councillor Doughty is absent. Councillor Evans?
Against.
Councillor Hocking?
For.
Councillor Pomfret?
For.
Councillor Sargent?
Against.
Councillor Tandy?
For.
Councillor Tromans?
Against.
And Councillor Rudkin.
For.
Again, Chair, it's tied 5-5, so it's Chair's
My
casting
casting
vote.
vote is for the motion, Chair.
Thank you. So that's carried.
Thank you. We'll move then to agenda item 12. Which I've lost.
It's the code, Chair. It's on page 76.
I've got there. This is the code of conduct for the employees. You would present this, please?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Yeah, we've, as part of our review of the Constitution, we go through particularly the Part 5, which has a lot of the codes and protocols for the council, and we do it on a sort of rolling basis, and the code of conduct for employees was a hangover from last year. We haven't completed it, so it's come forward to this year. Appendix A has a the code as it currently is, and then Appendix B, which is also attached, which starts at page 80, is a slightly longer version, but we think what we've tried to do is to pick up some of the sort of more salient points that have been issues that we've picked up as management over the course of the last 3 to 4 years specifically. It's a much more comprehensive code. What I can tell you, it talks in the background at 3.2, when it says the union, it's actually the trades unions that have been consulted. We have an accommodation agreement with both Unite and Unison, so they've both had an opportunity to consider and have made recommended changes that we've incorporated into the document to address certain issues. It has also been through management team who have also had a look at it and made some recommendations and changes. So I'd like to think that it's motherhood and apple pie, that it's a relatively straightforward document. We have tried to tie into some of the issues around particularly values that we wanted to incorporate, which are these for staff, and obviously to develop a slightly more detailed document for use by officers, so it's clearer. We've had some grey areas that have been quite difficult for some officers. So that Appendix B, Chair, is recommended to the committee for approval, and similarly it does sit in the Constitution, so we would ask that it be referred to Council for approval.
Okay, any comments?
Can I just have an assurance from Director Richardson, please, Chair, that we're not just going to print out the core values and pass that out, that people will get and be expected to know the detail of, because I'm looking, the one that strikes me is it should be C, but it's marked as A, political neutrality. If you look, it goes ADA.
Yeah.
If that can be changed to C, and the political neutrality one, when it expands it on page 82 at 5B.5,
Yeah.
that's a bit more reassuring. The way it reads under just the core values kind of implies that as long as it's something that's been lawfully phrased to you by the controlling group, you've got to do it, and that might be counter to the interests of other opposition groups. However, when I look at 5B.5 on page 82, it expands and clarifies in a way that is much more satisfactory. So I would be concerned if employees were only dished out, or the notice boards only got the little core values. I want the whole thing to be produced at once.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Any further?
Can I just have a clarification? What's the status of Appendix A?
That's our current code of conduct. That's what's in the Constitution now.
So that's going, basically.
That's going.
Right, I thought so.
And
So-
Appendix B is what's replaced.
Right, so that doesn't mention core values or anything.
Yeah, so we're not going to do an abridged version, is what I'm saying.
Is that right? I mean, it does have core values in there, but they're sort of subsumed within the whole document.
Yes.
There isn't a separate section.
And political neutrality, we specifically put that in.
Yeah, expanded.
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Evans.
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, it's just raising on the point that Councillor Troman's made with regards to the political neutrality paragraph on page 77. I just wondered what checks are made to ensure that party political leaflets are not on council notice boards, because I did witness a political party leaflet that I won't name the party that was on a notice board a few weeks back. Clearly that shouldn't have been allowed. This is a public building. I just wondered what checks are made to ensure that that doesn't occur.
I personally, I don't know, Chair.
I didn't see anything, I haven't seen.
I do know, I know of the instance in this case,
Oh, okay.
and it was the trades unions notice board. It shouldn't have been there, and it has been removed. And I understand that it was the Unison office, and those Unison have been notified to say it's a place where union literature can go, but not party political literature.
That's fine. Thank you, Philip.
Anyone else want to speak?
So pages 77, 78 and 79, they're gone, they're history, so we
Yeah.
shouldn't
Yes,
really
Yes.
be debating them unless we think they're better
So-
than
Yeah.
what is in
So page 80
Appendix
onwards.
B.
Yes.
Right.
Right, any further speakers? Okay, we then move back to 76 and see the recommendation and that the revised code of conduct for employees at Appendix B be approved and subject to 2.1, it be recommended to council that the constitution be amended accordingly. Is everyone in favour of that? Okay. Okay. So moving to agenda item 13. Here we go. This is talking about vice chairs at regulatory committees and audit and standards committee, Article 8 of the Council's Constitution.
Yes, Chair. I'm not going to say too much on this because it's fairly self-evident. The only thing I will do is say that there is an omission here because you will need similar wording to the bold text in Appendix 8 for this committee. This committee is actually in Article 9 of the Constitution, so it will have to translate that and make the necessary consequential changes to Article 9, where it refers to a regular committee of the Audit and Standards Committee. I think beyond that, I make that point because the recommendation just refers to planning applications and licensing. And that's right, because what we're actually saying is you can agree this for this committee, but we'll need to then refer this to those committees to consult them and get their agreement to it. I'd be surprised if they didn't want to do it, but there may well be issues with that, I don't know. So the recommendation 2.3 is that we, 2.2 is to consult those committees, and as long as they agree, then we can then implement that and take it through council and make the necessary changes to Articles 8 and 9.
Anyone wishes to speak? Councillor Owen?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Oh,
You've
yes,
got
I'm
two
sorry,
speakers,
I have Mrs Condacourt and Councillor Condacourt. My apologies.
First one, just a question. Is this not the already the case for the OSCs?
Yes, it is
Yes,
the
yeah.
case for the OSP.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I wanted to say was really that it's not future-proofing the wording at all and things, and it's also, if there are other opposition groups, it's meaning that no one else can ever be a vice chair. So I think it shouldn't be from the main opposition group. I mean, at the moment, there's a large Tory group, and obviously only one Green and things. But you're not future-proofing it for a different makeup of the council and things. If you make a will, when we made our will, we said, right, if we have children, X, Y, and Z happens. If this, happens and things, so that it was future-proofed. This is not future-proofing and things, so I don't like the wording, and I think it should be so that whatever the makeup of the council is in future times, you don't have to keep changing the wording because because there might not be just one main opposition group. It could be split between other parties in any particular sort of proportions.
As you made the point, Mrs Condacourt, if at some point there was a massive majority of one group on this council, it may have to be reconsidered, and also even a lot of smaller groups, as there are it may have to be reconsidered. but currently we do have a main opposition group. Councillor Condicle.
Thank you. I want to make a similar point, but also take the council back about 4 years when I was one of the 2 leaders of the opposition, when I was in a group of 3 and the Conservatives were a group of 3. So it's not a thing that will never happen. It happened in recent times that we've had 2 equal size opposition groups. And also there may be a decision of a committee actually with 2 large opposition groups that they may actually prefer to have to solve a deadlock, a third party group having a vice chair. I'm currently disenfranchised from virtually everything, and to have a constitution that further actually disenfranchises small groups I think is counterproductive. We also live in very interesting times in politics where both the main groups are having internal discussions about things, and so who knows what will happen in the future. There's been a breakaway independent group, and who knows if any councillors will join that. So I do think we need to write a constitution that is actually fairly future-proof and fairly flexible, which talks about the controlling group and other members, so that actually it's not much of a difference to the wording, but it just doesn't give this extra power. And we also have the case, and it's getting close to that at the county council, where the Lib Dems and the Labour groups are very similar sizes. So it would seem very perverse if one group had 9 and one had 8, that suddenly the group of 9 had a whole load of vice chairs and the group of 8 had none. So I think there does need to be some thought about future makeups of politics. And of course, we never know, we might get PR, in which case we'll get a nice diversity of councillors from a whole range of parties. Thank you.
As I said to Mrs. Condicle, if at some point there are massive changes to the membership of this council, then this issue may need to be reconsidered in the future. So, are there any speakers?
I've just got a comment to make, Chair, and that is, this is done upon democratic lines. I appreciate democracy doesn't favour the losers in that scenario, but if people are from small minority parties and can't get the votes, then it's not our job to be trying to give them prominence that their political appeal doesn't warrant. We are in on this side here the main opposition group, and we accept that. Now, to say it's unfair because there's only a couple of votes in it, well, actually, there's only 1 seat really in it. We're in a no overall control council, but you don't hear us bitching about it. It's democracy, and democracy is the right way to go. And the controlling group gets to hold the controlling group positions and chairs, and then whoever, whether that's Lib Dems or Conservatives or whoever it is the main opposition, whether it's by 1 or 10 seats, that's what democracy's decided. So I think criticising democracy, it's strange to hear that in a council meeting. I certainly think that, I'm very happy to support the democratic will of the people and go with that along the lines that have been outlined in Appendix A here. Thank you.
Councillor Evans.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just want to speak in favour of this, of what is being proposed. Just expanding on Councillor Troman's point about obviously the composition being in no overall control. After the elections last year, I would have liked to have seen the council do what Warwickshire County Council did in 2013 when that went into no overall control, where opposition groups were allowed to chair some of the committees. I think you actually chaired a committee yourself.
Can you stick
Chair.
to this item, please?
Yeah, I will.
Councillor
And
Evans?
I just wanted to clarify, will this decision be made by, hypothetically, the licensing committee and then it goes to full council, or is it just, licensing and planning that will decide?
We're basically consulting with those committees. One, because we've not really had that discussion with them, so we would like to have that discussion with those committees, get their view, and then we'll report that to council with any pluses or pros or cons from those committees, so that council can make a decision if need be. But
So it'll come back to the next audit and standards and then...
No. 2.3 is suggesting that we will we'll report, because I assume that if this committee approves the appointment of a vice chair for this committee, that can go straight to council now. The intention will be to consult with those other committees before the next full council and get a report to next full council, because what we'd like to do is have this ready for the next annual council and ready for the next municipal year. That's the sort of time plan.
There is just one, before I move the recommendation, there is just one caveat, and it is something that has been drawn certainly to my attention. To sit on any of those committees, this committee, Planning Applications Committee and Licensing Committee, a member has to have the adequate training to do so. I know that a lot of the training sessions that we hold for those committees are poorly attended. I think what we may have to do, unless it gets better, is to draw up a list of people who have undertaken the training in relation to, it's not so much on this committee, it's more on the substitute one, but it's the same sort of thing. And we really need to say, if you want to sub or if you want to be a vice chair, you will have to have that is what local government law states. You cannot sit on a regulatory committee unless you have adequate training to do so. So that will have to be addressed.
Yeah.
But we are at this point, as I said, it applies to both this item and the next one. So we have a recommendation. I'm not going to read it all out. 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. Is that agreed?
Before you take the vote, and if you can just add Article 9.
And, okay.
So it's, 2.1 says that the change in Appendix A and Article 9 be approved.
And that was in the changes to the Constitution. Yeah. Is that agreed? Thank you. The next item was allowing other members onto the OSP committee working groups. I think the report is pretty much self-explanatory, is it not?
I think it is, Chair. Councillor Evans has already referred to it, so I don't need to say anything other than obviously the proposal is we want to widen the scope for member involvement in working parties. We've had some working parties we've struggled to get members for because it's limited to members of a particular OSP, and that there are members in the other OSP who are actually quite willing to sit on that working party. So we've tried to accommodate that in the changes at 4E28.
At least 3 members have to be from the OSP and the rest can be made up from other members. So rather than, is there anyone wants to speak?
But we've got Councillor Mrs. Kandaka.
Oh, sorry, Mrs. Kandaka on this one.
Just to say, I think it's, a very good thing. It seemed, and I've been at OSPs where there've been arguments and things, and people not saying, oh, well, we can't do this and what have you and things. So opening it up seems a logical thing. I don't know why it's not been done before.
Okay, right. So is everyone in favour of that recommendation? Okay. Move to
we are coming to exclusion of press and public service, item 15,
we
Chair.
are on to agenda item 15, which, yes, fine, we're happy to, yes, okay. Thank you all for attending.
It's just on page 4, the resolution, Chair. If you go to page 4, right at the beginning, that's where the resolution is. There you go.
Right, item 15, exclusion of the public and the press. It is resolved that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public and press be excluded from the meeting during consideration of the following items. It being likely that there would be a disclosure of exempt information of the description specified in paragraph 1 of part 1 of Schedule 12A to the Act. Is that seconded?
Seconded.
Right, Philip, can you read it? Yeah, okay.
Okay, you need to...
We didn't really mean to lock you out.
Oh, that one. Is it you?
What I've done in your absence is simply I'm moving to the vote on the exclusion of the public and press.
Right.
So those in favour, please show. Thank you. Right.